we also have many issues in this COVID-19 pandemic to grapple with, some of which have already seen the light of the day, and there are a few others which will come up later on. Now, the thing is, as one moves from one wave to the second wave of the pandemic, there are various issues which one carries forward from the first to the second wave. These are the lessons learned which we would try and apply to the second wave of the pandemic. There are some surprises which I'm sure would be in store for all of us. And we would say, oh, we didn't see this in the first wave, and now we are seeing it in the second wave. And we always hope and pray that we see certain issues which would be favorable to mankind rather than being unfavorable to the mankind in the second wave. So to kick start, may I ask Dr. Ranga Reddy,
yes, sir.
The first question: how important has the current pandemic been to you as an administrator and to a director of an organization such as IFCAI, as far as this current pandemic has been?
I think
before you start answering that question, I'm sure there were some hits on the online. We have 1,650 viewers who have been listening very intently and being partaking as participants of this whole CME, and questions which come up from the audience could probably be passed on to me, and we could pass it on to the panelists, and probably that would enlighten the whole discussion in this panel. Yes? Sorry.
Dr. Iyer, thank you very much. I think the question is very, very relevant and important, that what we have learned in last 9 months. From the morning, various people have talked about on different aspects related to the sad story of the pandemic. Probably, even when I started actually inaugurating this particular conference, I said that, it had been a catastrophe. It has been an event of 100 years which has happened, and, the lives are destroyed, livelihoods are destroyed, etc., etc. Amongst all that, one silver lining, what I find is that finally we understood that there is going to be a lot of vulnerability in terms of the care what we provide. And we cannot take anything for granted, because for all these years we had been taking everything for granted. And as one of the colleagues has said in the presentation, that finally the infection preventionists have shown their worth. I think that is another silver lining, where the people have understood the need for infection prevention and control, and also the WASH, right, in the community level. As far as the infection control education is concerned, I am one way, of course, this is when we talk about pandemic, you cannot use the words that I am happy, but at the same time, to put the point across straight, I am happy that, this pandemic has happened, which has given the kind of opening of the minds of the people in order to understand that the capacity building of infection preventionists for any country is vital. And today, we have started this organization called as Infection Control Academy of India way back in 2015. And since then, when we were breaking our heads actually to get a little attention, I think, it has gone into deaf ears, both at medical community level, at administrative level, at state level, etc., etc. But today, to my surprise, pleasant surprise, that, starting from the central government to the state governments and various organizations within India and outside India are eagerly approaching and requesting to conduct some programs, and also to elaborate some of the educational programs we are doing in collaboration with University of Hyderabad and several other organizations both in India and abroad. And Dr. Iyer had been doing a lot of work in infection prevention and control, and he had played a major role in IIMM and HISI, where he had been doing a lot of work. I'm sure he would have had the same experience and probably the same feeling what I have expressed today. So in one way, Dr. Iyer, just to conclude what I said, that I am happy as a person who had been working for some time in hospital infection prevention and control, that today is the opportunity to strike on the iron which is very hard and mold this iron, in order to make our preparedness of our societies, our communities and our countries better. I think this is the opportunity which pandemic has given, and we should not be squandering that opportunity, and we have to build on what is already there. Thank you.
Professor Shamanna, I thought I would take forward with you, for the next discussion, to take forward from your talk which you gave us on managing healthcare workers. How do you think for instance, in the present pandemic, we have seen problems with healthcare workers, both in terms of them contracting nosocomial infections from patients, them giving infections to others, and also amongst themselves. There's been a lot of cross-transmission of COVID-19 infections. There's also been a lot of cross-transmission of other infectious problems, particularly with respect to the respiratory tract, such as maybe pneumococcal infections, viral respiratory infections, tuberculosis, and so on. A lot of these have been brushed under the carpet, because there's been a lot of focus on COVID-19, but then nobody really looks at H1N1 as a contender for COVID-19. Nobody looks at respiratory syncytial virus. Now we are into winter, and this is the time when you get respiratory syncytial virus, adenovirus, H1N1. There are umpteen viruses which come in, human metapneumovirus, Boca virus. These are, of course, more relevant in a pediatric hospital in children. But then there are so many bacterial and viral infections whose symptoms mimic COVID-19 infections. How do you look at healthcare workers in general, with respect to prevention of these infections in healthcare workers, so that they are fit enough to take care of patients if should there be a second pandemic awaiting us in December and January?
Thank you very much, sir. And first and foremost, I should say this panel discussion was sprung on me in the last moment. I can't thank Dr. Rangareddy enough. But that apart, let me draw an analogy here with respect to something like first aid or something like cardiopulmonary resuscitation. I think we expect every healthcare worker, or we expect every healthcare professional, or even a common man, in terms of being trained at least in the basics of CPR or first aid for that matter. Why not infection prevention and control practices? I think charity begins at home in terms of really making sure that we at least inculcate the basics of infection prevention and control practices across the board in the training programs of all healthcare workers, not necessarily special programs which we put together, etc. I think that's something which I think is very, very important. Just like the way we do first aid, just like the way we do for cardiopulmonary resuscitation, why not IPC practices? I think that's one thing which we can consider, and this pandemic has only strengthened our resolve in terms of making sure it is done. The other thing is, a lot of our education programs are very theoretical in nature. We talk about the organism, we talk about the modes of transmission, we talk about all the things which sometimes, and the rarest form of things which doesn't happen in our country, we will speak, and we will speak about it. But there is no practical sort of demonstration as to situations in terms of what you can do when there is infection, at a community level, what you can do when it is at an outpatient level, etc. I think this case-based learning or problem-based learning and those kind of things, and since my job is more in terms of education and training, I personally think a lot of our programs need to be turned on its head in terms of making sure that we expose people to practicalities of things like infection prevention and control, rather than going into the theoretical aspects. And very frankly, like I said before, I think our training programs lack that kind of a depth.
So what is your proposal? I mean, what is your suggestion for making it more practical?
I think
Say, for instance, if you just had to concentrate on training healthcare workers of all categories on proper use of PPE, proper hand hygiene, social distancing, taking the best of precautions in the worst of clinical case scenarios, particularly, say, healthcare workers in the emergency department, if you were to inculcate infection control practices, because that's where seconds and minutes count between death and life for somebody. So if they have to cater to that kind of emergency, but also, and at the same time also have a good amount of infection control being practiced in the casualty, in the emergency department, what would your proposal for training of those healthcare workers be?
My work mostly is with respect to communities and with respect to public health aspects related to infection
welcome
prevention
Dr.
and control. With respect to the question which you have, I think first and foremost thing is actually to look at curricula in terms of all our training programs, etc. We have an opportunity with respect to the NMC now instead of the MCI, if you're looking at thing. And we also have the professional council, which is going to be probably passed in Parliament for allied healthcare workers. We also have regulatory, and accrediting agencies, etc., etc. Here is an opportunity for us actually to bring about this kind of a change. And since I work at the sort of community end of this particular spectrum, my contention is communication becomes very paramount. Like for instance, today we talk about SMS. SMS is something which every person knows. S stands for, I wouldn't say social, I wouldn't say physical. We have made it, I think consciously, we have said safe distancing. Because there are a lot of connotations with respect to social as well as physical distancing. So we call it safe distancing. If you want to translate it to Togas ka Duri, that is fine. So it's safe distancing, mask or face cover. I think we have to be very clear in terms of saying, when you say mask, everybody thinks it's a surgical mask. So it's very important that you demystify communication messages to communities and especially to people. Or you talk about sanitation. SMS, the S is safe distancing, masking and sanitation. That's something which everybody understands. So for at least at the preventing level at this thing, if you can demystify messages and convey it to people, I think it will help in terms of they percolating the messages to the people concerned. For frontline healthcare workers, we call it WMD, which is like weapons of mass destruction. Again, washing, masking, distancing against corona. That is the weapon of mass destruction against the coronavirus. What I mean to say is communication becomes very, very important, and that communication has to be demystified. So with respect to the clinical part of it, I'm not competent enough to answer that question.
Yes, Dr. Gansham.
Since I have worked all through my career life in corporate hospitals, I would like to present a completely different perspective. See, one of the major areas where we are worried about the spread of infections, not just with respect to COVID, but with respect to any other hospital-acquired infections, is your housekeeping staff, your nursing staff. Now, I had the chance of leading the task force for COVID-19 at my organization. And the first thing when I did was when I had a meeting with the housekeeping and the nursing staff, I have realized that most of these people are willing to learn. But we don't have people who have the time or the commitment to train them.
Or the inclination, yes.
Second, if you look at most of the hospitals, see, we need to accept the fact that private healthcare contributes to a significant amount of healthcare in this country.
2/3.
What is the qualification of a housekeeping staff who who works in an intensive care unit or for the matter in the theaters. Nobody actually regulates that. Whether the housekeeping staff is trained enough to handle these things, whether the nurses are trained enough to handle these things, nobody cares or nobody bothers. So until unless we have some kind of a regularization body, see that's one language we all understand.
Regulation.
Until unless we have a kind of a regulation body which says that until unless somebody has been trained in certain aspects of caregiving, they cannot be involved in the critical areas, it's going to be very, very difficult. Because these are the people who will be going from one patient to another, from another patient to another. So I think that's a very, very vital and key aspect of preventing healthcare infections.
How about sounding the Nursing Council of India? Just as we have a National Medical Council now, probably there's the Nursing
yes,
Council of India.
I totally agree with you. Again, see, we also need to look at what kind of nurses are we actually allowing into our hospitals. Now,
ANMs, GNMs.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's very scary to see that a nurse stands in front of the patient, not knowing what to do, not knowing how to put an IV line,
Yes.
or not knowing how to connect the saline to the IV cannula. So when you have that kind of unregulated entry of nurses, you go to any city, in every other lane you have a nursing college.
Yeah.
Who is actually monitoring the training? See, doctors, I do understand, play a very, very vital role. But at the end of the day, the people who spend the maximum amount of time with the patient is the nurses and your housekeeping staff.
Yes.
So they are the core, I would say, core aspects. If you have to win this battle against hospital-acquired infections, they are the people who have to be trained.
You've been working a lot in critical care of the Medicover hospitals. Now, there is a way by which the ICMR said that you classify, even the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare laid down guidelines over these last few months, maybe 6 to 8 months. You classify patients into mild, moderate, and severe. Then they said mild, moderate A, moderate B, and then severe. There's been so many classifications have been floating around. But practically, how have you been able to classify COVID patients coming to your hospital into clinical categories, and what have been the pearls and the pitfalls of classifying them into those categories? Has it been successful following some guideline, or at the end of the day you've said, no, this is how I will do it, and this is how it works for me?
To a large extent, I think at our institute, we were fairly successful. In the last about 6 months or so, we were, if I have to just put a ballpark figure, we were able to treat close to 3,000 patients as IP patients. When the pandemic started, I started with about 10 beds for the ICU.
Okay.
We said we will keep these 10 beds dedicated to the COVID ICU patients. But as the numbers increased, we realized that the 10 beds are not going to be sufficient. So my original medical intensive care unit, which was a 24-bedded ICU, I had to convert the entire 24-bed, add another 8 beds and 10 beds on either side to make it a 40-bedded ICU.
Borrow from somewhere else and make it. Okay.
We were very clear. I was lucky to have a very good team of physicians and pulmonologists, and good support from the medical administrator. We were very clear that anybody who is not requiring oxygen will be managed on outpatient basis. We segregated areas in the hospital into dedicated COVID consultation zones where the internal medicine physicians and the pulmonologists were willing to review patients who did not require oxygen on day 1, to call them after a couple of days, follow up with the blood investigations, and then see if there was any worsening.
Right.
Now you can break the COVID into multiple
subcategories.
Phases. In the very, very early days, we didn't know what worked. We did not have any antivirals. There was a lot of controversy whether you should use oral antivirals.
Favipiravir or remdesivir.
Use hydroxychloroquine, we use remdesivir. But as things evolved, whether it's good, bad, whether evidence supports the benefit of use of antivirals or not, but what it actually helped us was evolve a protocol.
Yeah.
at least helped us in finalizing a game plan which said, okay, if the patient has an involvement of the lung with significant requirement for oxygen, we will give remdesivir, we will give steroids, we will give anticoagulation. So that protocol was clearly established. So patients who came to the ER were triaged and categorized based on whether they would need either oxygen or I would admit here that we use a lot of CT scans.
Use CT scan.
HRCTs. Okay. We did a lot of CT scans because that actually helped us stratify or at least
Gave you
have
correct
an idea
scores.
about, because initially getting an RT-PCR was very, very difficult. Getting an RT-PCR was very difficult. You had to send it to only dedicated labs and it would take at least 48 hours for the results to come.
That was the time when they said only send it to government laboratories.
Yes. So
to
we,
NIMS.
see, for a clinician who is sitting there when a patient comes with symptoms and then there's a pandemic going on, you can't tell him, I'll get a swab, you come back after 48 hours.
48 hours.
And at that point of time, we had to resort to a lot of HRCTs, which gave us a fairly good idea about how significant the lung was involved.
Yes.
If we found or if we thought that there was significant lung involvement and or if the patient needed oxygen, all of them went to the ICUs. Patients with milder forms and still requiring a less than about 8 to 10 liters of oxygen were admitted to the wards.
Yes.
Okay. Other patients who were stable were discharged home with the follow-up by the physicians who were in touch with the patients, asked them to report for any further worsening of symptoms. Everybody was advised to monitor their oxygen saturations, a 6-minute walk test and see if the saturations fell after you do a 6-minute walk test, and some of the basic inflammatory markers which were the first cues to say whether the patient was heading towards a severe COVID. So yes, it did help us significantly in the initial stages because again it was probably because we had planned well in advance. We were having everyday meetings with the entire team as to how do we, because we knew that we would be able to accommodate say about a maximum of 100, 120 patients. And the way the numbers were being reported from across the world, we were not sure
Whether you would be able
it
to
would
do
be just
justice
one
to
time.
all the patients
Yes.
who came to your hospital.
So I think if we can plan it out, you will be able to do it. But again, then you will have certain patients whom you think are stable, whom you would advise them to sit at home, but they would come back in a very, very bad condition. And then it would be very difficult to explain to the families as to why the deterioration happened and
So
why we
what's
did
the
not admit
thin
the patient.
dividing line between those patients who initially appear to be perfectly okay, though they are COVID positive, but then we can't say that they are asymptomatic, they may be mildly symptomatic with just some fever and a bit of a runny nose and things like that. But then suddenly they come down, they just walk downhill within 24 to 48 hours and they land up in the ICU, versus some people who are frankly symptomatic. They also have been a bit breathless. Their oxygen saturations are hovering around between 93 and 94, so therefore you admit them. But then within 24 to 48 hours, even without giving any of the antivirals, they just stabilize. Has there been a possibility by which you've been able to divide these two categories of patients? Is there a thin line that divides the two?
See, by the early reports of from Wuhan and from the European experience suggested that anybody who is on the elderly side of age, risk factors like hypertension, diabetes, or any other comorbid conditions are likely to have a severe COVID-19. But very surprisingly, we had patients who were above 75 who tolerated the virus with
Wonderfully.
absolutely no symptoms. At the same time, we had a large number of youngsters between say 30-35 to 55 to 60.
55.
This was the age group where we thought the mortality was the highest.
Higher.
And a very worrying factor or trend we saw was younger people less than 50 years who are short statured, who are slightly on the overweight side, especially with
Obese.
bellies.
Diabetic, probably.
They were people who mounted a very, very severe inflammatory response. So to categorize them as healthy based on age was something that we were very reluctant to do, because most of the patients whom we saw them getting deteriorated were younger, more on the higher side of the age.
Yes.
And again, this is a very, very personal experience, a personal bias, I mean, you will say. But I have always found anybody with a type A personality, I always was worried, somebody who's very anxious, somebody, when I interacted with the family, said that this is very, very, somebody who is very impulsive. I've always found them to be responding to the virus in a very severe way. Maybe because they don't put on the mask, they don't resort to the instructions.
Yeah.
But yes, though age, hypertension, diabetes, medical conditions were the
Criteria.
accepted criteria,
Yeah.
we were very worried with youngsters who are coming, who were slightly on the higher side of the weight, obese individuals.
Before I move on to another speaker, what kind of biomarkers have you relied on? There's been a lot of talk. There have been hundreds and thousands of requisitions for IL-6, TROPI, TROP-T, procalcitonin, CRP, ESR. Some people have even resorted to doing ESR. I mean, it's a little funny. CRP, procalcitonin, I can still understand as acute inflammatory markers. IL-6, yes. But then, there's been a lot of debate. There's been a lot of proponents and opponents for each biomarker. Yeah. There are multiple publications, some of them saying, yes, this is wonderful. Some people are saying it's useless. So what's been your experience?
See, right from day one till today, we are following a set of, we will look at the D-dimer,
yes.
ferritins,
yeah.
CRPs. Initially, we did follow the IL-6 when there was a lot of reports of tocilizumab being used and tocilizumab being used in patients who had very high IL-6 levels, and the concept of cytokine storm being the major determinant of mortality.
Yeah.
But in my own understanding, I have found that more number of patients actually died with refractory hypoxia, which is typical of what severe viral pneumonia causes. The number of patients where you can say that people have died of cytokine storm, where your inflammatory markers were through the roof, we didn't see that kind of a finding in majority of the patients.
Okay.
Patients still died with decreasing D-dimers, not so high ferritins, decreasing CRP levels, interleukin-6 being normal. Despite that, patients died. So majority of the patients in our own experience died because of severe refractory hypoxia, which is again typical of any other ARDS or any other viral pneumonia that you see across. Even H1N1 people died of hypoxia.
Sure.
We never, again, if you look at interleukin-6 has been a marker which is elevated in various critical ill conditions like trauma, sepsis, and ARDS of various etiologies. You find the IL-6 levels to be high. But somehow it got a lot of exposure, or got a lot of investigation at this pandemic. So nothing in specific. Clinical parameters were the most important things. Yes, we did look at D-dimers, ferritin, CRP. Lymphocyte counts was something that we always kept a watch on.
The imbalance between neutrophil lymphocytic ratio. Thank you so much, Dr. Lalit.
Yeah.
You work for Reddy's Laboratories.
Yes.
You're affiliated to them. How has your experience been with a lot of talk on shortage? There was a desperate, scrounging for antivirals, remdesivir, favipiravir, hydroxychloroquine, doxycycline, azithromycin. Everything was out of stock.
Yes.
Similarly, with disinfectants, everything was out of stock. You asked for N95s, everything was out of stock. In the month of April, May, I think that was the most crucial time when there was an AIMS protocol which said you reuse your N95. To me, I found it a little funny, where if you have to take out N95 mask, put it into a cover, keep it at one place, and then you take it out on the 5th day and again start reusing the same thing. Obviously there is no place, you can't take it home and keep it. And in your hospital, you're contaminating the environment. If you're going to take out all that, as much as possible, you put it inside a cover, you mark a date, the day. Still, I found it a little funny, though we all had to practice it because of the shortage. How have you, as a company, dealt with this kind of a situation where, you were called upon to produce, manufacture, distribute, acquire, procure and distribute a number of antivirals, medicines of various types, including steroids and things like that. Everything went into a shortage. So what's been your experience?
Yeah. Thanks for this question. You see, when the pandemic started, it caught us for surprise because we never expected this pandemic will go in such volumes. So when initially we have businesses in other countries, when other countries were getting affected, and then initially we were projecting numbers for India also, and how much numbers will go to India. And we have businesses in all other countries, so we were projecting numbers for US also, and which drugs may go into shortage. So our first thing was, what are the drugs that we had to ramp up our capacity? So there we were looking at anticoagulants. We were also, because anticoagulants, we understood that not only in the it will help in kind of reducing the blood clots and coagulation, but it also has an important element within the pathophysiology of the disease. Because anticoagulants, if you give at a kind of determined time, then it will also reduce the complications which will arise out of COVID. So we realized this part quite early, and then anticoagulants were our one of the things that we ramped up the manufacturing and capacities of that.
Yes.
Then on this other part, we were looking at the antibiotics, the respiratory antibiotics particularly, which would help. So we were focusing on what kind of antibiotics will be given. So azithromycin and other kind of antibiotics in the respi class we were focusing. But then we soon realized what other medications, so steroids as you rightly said. But then we also realized that eventually it is the antivirals that we will have to work on, because being a viral disease, antibiotics we will just cover the secondary infections, but antivirals we have to be really strong on. But there were no antivirals. So this is something that we have to learn for the future also, that broad spectrum antibiotics companies keep working a lot. But then
Nobody works on antivirals.
Nobody works on broad spectrum antivirals. Something, this COVID-19, it could not be the last pandemic.
Yeah.
We know in future also there are possibilities of pandemic. So what we are doing for the future, that is also something we'll have to take lessons.
So what are your proposals in your company? I mean, have you been able to put forward certain things for developing or at least purporting antivirals, keeping them ready for distribution should a second wave, which will prove to be more severe than the first wave, to hit India?
Yes. So both favipiravir as well as remdesivir. So both this so favipiravir we went ahead and did partnership with the innovator themselves, Fujifilm, and then brought the drug to India, which is Evigan. We brought this to India. But on the other thing, we also realized that remdesivir, which is a more potent antiviral, we developed it and are ramping up the capacity like anything. The drug is still, whatever we are producing, it's getting consumed the other day.
Yes.
So we are continuously increasing, and we backward integrated the manufacturing right from API towards and we also did the partnership, of course, that was required with Gilead for the tech transfer of the remdesivir. So both remdesivir and favipiravir, we built up our capacities. But again, coming on to the point, how did the industry react to it? So the thing is, as doctor said, in the initial few months, we did not have antivirals. Because the drugs that will act are not antibiotics. The drugs that will act will have the profound impact will be the antivirals. We lost certain crucial months in the beginning. So if we take this learning and in future, we have the broad spectrum antivirals research initiated, taking this as a learning from COVID-19, and then keep the platforms ready so that next time if something else comes, some other coronavirus, some other strain of some other virus, mostly this would be respiratory in nature, or it could be other systems also.
It could be a mutated coronavirus itself.
It could be a mutated coronavirus itself.
If
yes.
that happens, and then we are concentrating now, I find, all of us concentrating and saying remdesivir, favipiravir, remdesivir, favipiravir. What if you had a mutated COVID-19 strain which proved resistant to remdesivir and favipiravir? It is not unusual to come across such a strain.
Yes.
Because with when H1N1 hit the headlines, we had everybody being put on oseltamivir. You know, Tamiflu, Tamiflu, Tamiflu. But then now we do have oseltamivir resistant H1N1. So, causing very florid viral pneumonias, and patients do die of H1N1 pneumonias as well. So, is there a plan for the future? Have people thought of any such drugs, pharmacologists or, or on the clinical side, affiliated to companies, where there has been some talk of further antivirals being developed or being used, proposed to be used in the community, should the second wave and the third wave come up, where remdesivir is no longer clinically useful?
Yeah, so this thought process has started, but has not matured enough, because currently we are busy in handling the current situation, the remdesivir and favipiravir need itself. And we think we also will have to bring something which is more effective in preventing the infection, that is a vaccine. So vaccine is our immediate focus, along with both antivirals, remdesivir and favipiravir. But in future, yes, we have already started a thought, be it a mutated coronavirus or be it a mutated influenza virus, or any other virus which may come in future. We may have to be more ready so that we don't kind of lose these initial critical months. And if we would have something more effective at that point, maybe we would not have seen the pandemic of such big nature.
You're open to keeping other options.
Yes, for the future. And one more thing here, even while developing the kind of hospital management protocols, we realized one thing, why this virus causes such a big impact on the individual. Some subjects would recover easily, while some will not. And what is it which is causing, how we can prevent it, how we can better treat it? When we go in that depth, we realize that it's actually the demarcation between the viral phase and the immune phase, which is very critical. The virus replicates very fast. This viral has a very good reproductive rate, as we all know, replicates very fast. And then, so the initial viral phase where the replication is happening, that is a sweet spot where we have to give antivirals. What has happened is, why I'm saying this is, because of the shortage of these antivirals, the antiviral administration to many patients have been delayed. And when actually the patient comes to hospital, when the antivirals are administered, he already moves to the immune phase from the viral
Probably
phase.
has been too late.
It is already too late. The viral has almost declined or stopped replicating, and now it's the exaggerated immune response that is causing the havoc in the body.
And at that time, you're trying to give antivirals.
And that time we are giving antivirals. Again, it is not that much effective. So, and many patients have died because of this mistiming. It's not a fault of anyone. It is just because this condition took everyone by surprise, and it took time to get all the drugs in the market. It took time to understand when we should give what should be the protocol. But I think in future we have to take all these learnings, be ready for the drugs, and then also have those protocols, kind of a tentative protocols, where we clearly know, okay, which phase we have to give what. Right. So, and have better management.
Just to add to what Dr.
Sure.
said,
Yes, Dr.
I completely agree with what he said. See, initially, the media created so much of hype about the steroids. At one point of time, we did not have antivirals, but steroids are very easily available. So we used to get a large number of patients who took steroids without antivirals in the very, very early stage of the disease, and then presented to the hospital in a very, very bad shape. That happened.
Yeah. To continue this, Dr. Jagatkar, what's been your experience in this last 6 months with diagnostic services, and what would you propose? Now I'm moving on to the future. Okay, I mean, all this is lessons learned. Now, how do we apply this to the future? So, how what aspects of diagnostic COVID service would you expect in your hospital in the future, should the second wave come in and we see a number of patients presenting with a variety of symptoms and you feel all of that could be COVID-19, what would you expect from a diagnostic laboratory division?
See, I think one of the major things would be to get a diagnosis as early as possible.
Right.
In
A reverse
initial-
transcriptase, a real-time PCR would take at a minimum of 4 hours.
4 hours. And that too, you have to send the RT-PCR in designated or the centers which are only approved by the government. There are a large number of patients who fitted into the clinical diagnosis of COVID,
But were
who fitted
reported
into
as
the
COVID
radiological
negative.
diagnosis of COVID, but for the want of a positive lab report, neither the family accepted that they had COVID. It was a difficult time for us
Nor
to
could you
convince
hold
them.
on to them as
Yes.
COVID. I
So we
understand.
need to have tests which are, probably more easily available, give the results within a few hours, if not.
Isn't that available now with the privates also doing COVID testing?
Yes, we are
it's-
lucky enough because our own center is now recognized. So
Similarly,
that
all
kind
of the laboratories are also there in the private sector over the last 5 months at least.
Yes.
4-5 months.
Yes. So one,
It's improved.
when you're dealing with the pandemic, you need to have easy access to diagnostics because,
Okay.
again, one thing that we have all understood and learned in the pandemic is test. You test them early,
Yeah.
you identify them.
Yeah.
If you can quarantine them. If you can treat them, or if you can, whatever needs to be done next will be dependent on whether you can test them or not. So until unless we have wide availability of laboratories which can give, fairly good idea about what the probability of the disease that you're dealing with,
Yeah.
we are going to face a lot of problems. Even in the second wave, I'm not sure if we have come to that point where we can test in that capacity.
Dr. Ranga Reddy and Professor, it's a joint question to both of you. How do you look at IFCAI as an organization, or for that matter, any such organization in the country? How do you think you could help or play a role in the future wave of the pandemic? And how would you propose to strengthen training and training of staff, training of healthcare workers at all levels in preparation for the second wave and the third wave of the pandemic?
I think, Infection Control Academy, when it has kind of said loudly in 2016 that by 2023 we want to create a capacity of 50,000 infection preventionists in India. I think that time itself we probably have seeded the preparedness for the current pandemic and any other pandemic which is going to come in the future. Specifically, for the second wave, countering the second wave or countering the third wave, I think, we had been doing n number of programs in order to work with healthcare worker community and general communities in order to improve the awareness so that so that we don't be reactive but proactive. Because when the COVID came, as usual, we were reactive and it was useless actually because we did not know much about it. We had been learning on feet how to deal with that, and of course a thing or two we have learned in last 6 months. But if we had to be proactive, that means we definitely borrowing from what you said, we had to build the systems, we had to build the process, we had to give the clarity to the people on how to ensure that you are going to think in a way how it is going to be alleviating or getting you out of actually given situation. I think that is where our focus would be at Infection Control Academy of India, to organize more sensitization programs, bringing cross-functional teams together so that there is a cross-pollination of the ideas, so that we today we have people coming from industry who are working on the vaccines, and also academia, and also, critical care, you yourself being the leader in microbiology, right? So if we are going to sit across the table, probably we can cross-pollinate and bring the different views of the same problem and find finally a solution so that we can avert the phase 2 and the phase 3 or stage 2 or stage 3, whatever you want to call it.
Your view?
Thank you, sir. I think first and foremost, I think the immediate problem which exists with respect to our healthcare workers is the fact that there is a lot of fatigue. When I say there's a lot of fatigue, I think people have been working for the last 9 or 10 months, and this fatigue factor has set in from the healthcare workers' perspective.
Certainly.
From the community's perspective, there's a chalta hai attitude. When I say there's a chalta hai attitude, unless until there's been some bad outcome or they've seen somebody who succumbed to this particular problem, I think it's been more in terms of saying that kuch nahi hota. So I think these two problems which we need to address immediately in terms of making sure that we are as prepared for the second wave as thing. Education and training, I think there's the thinking is we need to set up this hub and spoke sort of entities in terms of making sure that the hubs are already there. They have been capacitated. Now it's important to develop those hub and spoke model with respect to all the institutions which are in some form or the other, either training or building capacities or skills among institutions, even to the lowest thing. I would be provocative if I say that we have a large force of people who actually belong to the other systems of medicine, right? And when I say other systems of medicine, maybe the Indian system of medicine, the Ayush and other things.
Homeopathy, Ayurveda.
I think our fraternity has been very confrontational. I don't know why I say that, but I say it with all the responsibility at my command. I say that we find that we have not been very conducive to building up partnerships and collaborations with these people.
With
and
the
we always think that they do mediocre stuff. That's been our thing. I think unless until we mentally
break out of that,
break those barriers, this cannot be, sort of empowered in terms of building a. Nothing can work in isolation. I think you can produce n number of specialists, you can produce n number of infection preventionists, if you want to call it. But I think we need collaboration.
Dr. Lalit Lakhwani, lastly, I have 2 questions for you. The first thing is, what changes do you think would happen in the pharma industry when the second wave comes in? What do you think will unfold in what would be the challenges posed to the pharmaceutical industry, and how do you think they should respond when the second wave just hits us?
Yeah. So at the moment, we think the best way to handle this pandemic is through vaccine. And
just coming to that,
yeah,
second question.
Yeah, and to vaccinate the individuals. So one thing is development of vaccine.
Yeah.
But the other thing is to implement vaccination in such a large population.
Are you involved in a vaccine development trial?
Yes. So the vaccine which Dr. Reddy's has been developing, the Sputnik V vaccine. So that clinical trial is already has been initiated in India.
It's commenced.
Yeah, so it's commenced, and we are actively working on that trial so as to bring the vaccine as early as possible to the Indian population.
And when would that be? Any approximate dates you could give us?
So
time frame?
Yeah, so the trial is actually because we have to see the long-term effect also.
Yeah, true.
So the full trial will be actually a 1-year trial, but we expect that there will be interim analysis also during the trial. The interim analysis may happen maybe 3 to 4 months from now, and this is a time we will get a very good amount of data to enable the authorization. We expect, but that these are all subject to discussions with the Indian regulators. So the data that will come, this data will decide whether we get the authorization on the interim analysis
So you would
part.
say that most of the response from a pharmaceutical perspective would be on ensuring that we have some reasonably good vaccines
Yes.
for the COVID-19
Yes,
to
reasonably.
contain future waves of the pandemic.
Yes, reasonably good vaccine. And initially, till if you would have asked this question just 15 days back, so I would have some dilemma because I would not know whether the vaccines, we were confident vaccines will work, but how much will work? Okay, government says, or we say regulators say anything more than 50% is okay. 15% efficacy is okay. But will a vaccine which is 50% or 60% effective, will it end the pandemic? Answer may not be, answer may be no. Because,
What's your view on herd immunity?
yeah, that is where the herd immunity and the vaccine would together
Will it
do the work.
amalgamate together?
Will amalgamate together to do the work. But now, because as I said 15 days back, this was our understanding that okay, the vaccines may work anything between 60% to the full 90%, 95%. But the data, it's such a dynamic situation. The data is coming in, day out. So in the last week, there were 3 press releases you may have seen. One from the Pfizer BioNTech, and then other was from the Moderna, and the third was one was our own
So likewise,
vaccine.
there are many companies which are trying to work on the same.
Yeah, and the 3 press releases which I was coming to, all these 3 press releases are consistent with more than 90% efficacy. So that is one point. This last week has been very good for us. We definitely know that most of the vaccines which are based on these technologies, either mRNA technology or in recombinant technology with adenoviral vectors. So both these technologies are working well. At least we know now. 15 days back we did not knew that.
You didn't know.
So because now when the data is coming in, and Pfizer, Moderna, they have also this data from the interim analysis only, but at least Pfizer says it works 90%, and Moderna has 94%, and our vaccine 92%. So something between 90 to 95. This is a very good data. This is a very good data, and we are very hopeful that once these vaccines, once we vaccinate the individuals on a mass scale, it will actually be the most important step to end this pandemic.
Right. Thank you so much. There's one question from one of our online viewers. Dr. Vijay Bhaskar wants to know, in rural areas of India, no COVID-19 protocol is followed, such as wearing a mask or practicing social distancing. As an infection control organization, how do we motivate them about the second wave and the need to practice these in rural India?
Yeah, I think, to your last question, I have answered partially that, what is that we are going to do in next 3 to 6 months. One of the things what we have changed in last 6 months is we have also taken a conscious decision that we will be, while we are working with the professionals, while we are working with the healthcare workers,
Yeah.
we will also start working with communities, right? Through electronic media, through print media,
Yeah.
and also through government in order to create the awareness. We have done at least 40 to 50 sensitization programs, and we also have involved such non-governmental organizations like Rotary. Rotary is one of the biggest organizations which has helped India to eradicate polio. We all are aware of that. We also have involved them because they have got a very large network all over India. We involve them actually to carry the message through their volunteer system into the masses, that is especially the rural and semi-urban areas, because urban areas, you have got a better infrastructure, but rural areas, to carry the message, you definitely need, apart from mass media, that is electronic and print media, you also need volunteers who have that zeal actually to go and
There has to
work
be a
in the
personal
communities.
communique.
So I think, that is the way to work. It needs sensitization, and also our small experiment actually with some of the areas within Siddipet district is that we have worked very closely with the community leaders, that is the sarpanches and the village heads, in order to propagate, and also give a kind of stern warning sometimes to the people who are not wearing the mask and doing public
disobey,
who are not actually complying with the COVID-19 norms. So we have worked, and sometimes blowing that hot and along with blowing cold has worked in some instances. I think we had to build upon that, so that that kind of awareness is strengthened within the villages. I think that is my view.
Well, any other views?
I think one probable view, and to a large extent why it hasn't spread to the rural areas, is because it's a disease which has been traveling. I was very skeptical or scared when we had this migrant issues, because we got it from people who traveled from international to national, and cities to villages. When they traveled, they spread the disease in the village. So if there was some sort of a reverse quarantine, or it's some sort of reverse protection in terms of our own rural populace, and if you had prevented people from the urban areas getting into the rural areas, to a large extent, I think. And let me tell you, something is protecting us in terms of the lower and middle income countries, whether it is vaccination or whether it is being exposed to a lot of these kind. There is some sort of immunity which is there. But what it is, I think we need to investigate further. So insulating communities would probably be one of the other ways of protecting our rural population, is what I think, sir.
Well, you want to say something? I'll just close the session first. Thank you so much to all the panelists who have taken out time from their busy schedules to be with us for today's panel discussion on this very, very important. It may sound very abstract, but then actually it's more practical. And it's very important to be aware of certain things as India braces itself to face the second wave of the pandemic. To participate in this COVID-19 pandemic and infection control lessons learned for the future. It's something which you take from the past and try and apply it to the future. What changes you need to make, what modifications one needs to do to be able to face the second wave of the pandemic, and make sure that the Indian population does not suffer so badly from the second wave or the future waves of the pandemic. With that, I would close this session on the panel discussion. Thank you once again, firstly to all the panelists for having taken out precious time from their busy schedules to be with us, and and a big thanksgiving to the audience, both who are physically present as well as those who have joined us online. And it's something like a huge 1,600 people who have been watching us. Thanks to everyone, because without an audience, there cannot be a panel discussion, because unless there is an audience, there is no way that we are going to take this entire information forward to so many more people. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Dr. Ranganathan Iyer, for your time, and I think it's a wonderful moderation and the panel discussions. Thank you so much. I request my colleague to come just to hand over a memento to Dr. Ghanshyam and also to Dr. Lalit for making